Part 3 of our trilogy at this conference titled Disrupting Democracy here in Hamburg today. Thank you so much for coming, and I'm very pleased to welcome Samir Saran from India, who's running India's biggest think tank. And not only this, he's also part of the group of people who govern the cyberspace, or who discuss and regulate the governance of the cyberspace. Also, he organizes India's biggest internet conference, and he warmly appreciates everyone coming there and joining this. Samir will talk with Shoshana Zuboff and Malka Older today. Their common topic is the idea of new digital states. So we've had a discussion about how much of the internet can the state really regulate, and we heard many times Mark Zuckerberg's statements building global community and how much Facebook wants to become the fabric of the social community. So Shoshana Zuboff, just quickly, is probably, she's the grande dame of research on digitalization, and I'm very, very pleased that she'll be joining our conference through Skype. And she's currently in the last steps of finishing her book, her next book, which will come out early 2018, and it's about how much soul can an automated society maintain. And already in the early 80s, Shoshana was doing a lot of research on the effects of digitalization on the way we work, the way we live, and the way we live together. As we all know, digitalization has expanded its reach, and it's not only at work where we're using a computer and then we're going home. It's all the time, everywhere. And this is what Shoshana will be speaking about with us. And Malka Older is a disaster relief researcher who is one of those people doing the first response after a catastrophe. Think of tsunamis. She actually went to Fukushima right after the catastrophe, and she was helping to set up structures, state-like structures for people so that life can go on. And during the course of her research on this, she was actually studying at Sciences Po in Paris and was part of the Carnegie Council on Security. She wrote a book, a science fiction that some people say is supposed to become something like the next cyberpunk, big cyberpunk book called Infomocracy. Infomocracy came out last year, and in English to high praise, and we've just learned that she's about to publish her next book, Null States, which extends the ideas that she's developing in Infomocracy. And in Infomocracy, we really see a new state model being developed. And she will speak about this, and she will also discuss this with Samir, who knows so much about digital governance. Thank you so much for coming here. Samir, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hannes. I was told to speak into the mic, which is very difficult for an Indian who moves his head 60 times every minute. But let me try. What I would like to do is to briefly tell you a few nuggets, a few bits of facts from where I come from. And where I come from is important for the future of the internet simply because India adds 6 to 8 million new users every month. That's more than the population of Israel. That's the number of new internet users coming onto the net. Now, believe you me, before net, they were not even connected to the cities 100 kilometers away from them. It was difficult for them to reach out to communities 100, 500, 1,000 kilometers away from them. The internet allows them to talk to you. So these are 6 million new people who have never interacted with the geographical neighbors, but are now beginning to aggregate. with all of you. They perhaps will form deeper relationships with some of you based on ideas, ideologies, ethics, and morality than they would with their own neighbors. So what does that do to a nation where the largest part of the population is more connected to people who reside outside the territory? What is the importance of borders today? What is the connection that keeps the populations together? And I think this is one question that every nation, I have just given you the example of India, but every nation is beginning to think about this new virtual nationhood that is taking hold. Now, sometimes people say we have Planet Google, we have Planet Facebook. Most of them are bigger than most countries. Facebook today is bigger than India in terms of number of people who reside there. I'm a citizen of Facebook. My day does not begin until I have posted on Facebook, and then there are 5 more posts, and then I can't sleep until I do my last post. And then I wake up in the middle and I think, did I say that on Facebook yet? No, I wake up and I post again. Facebook for me is as important as any other facet of my life. And I unabashedly say that. And many of us today live virtually in a far more engaged manner than we live in the real world. And I think that is the second issue that we must think about. Our virtual personalities, our virtual identities today. I consume virtually. I consummate virtually. I am titillated by cuisines online. I am excited by cultures online. The online world for me is very near the real world for me now. And I am not a millennial. Go down to the next generation and this becomes deeper. So that's one part that we are seeing in India. A whole new generation of 550 million young Indians are beginning to embrace the internet at 6 million new users a month. The second issue, and I think this is equally important, is that each individual has been reduced to his data points. We are all data. When I transact online, I am a data point. When I decide to travel to a certain place, I am another data point. When I communicate with someone, that itself is data. Samir Saran, that's me, is basically a million data points online. Am I in control of this data point? Do I control Samir Saran online, or is Samir Saran actually controlled and managed and curated by Facebook or Google or someone else who I choose to be my favorite medium? So data integrity, and I think this is something that consumes Europeans more than any other continent. The integrity of my data, who uses my data, for what purpose, how can the commercial benefits of this data flow back to me, flow back to society? Should monopolies emerge? Should digital companies have so much power? Are again questions that we all need to think about. It's happening. Now, I am one of those who does believe that the march of technology is irreversible. Technology has its own rhythm, and regulations will lose in the end. That is my belief. The two co-panelists who will join us will give you very interesting perspectives. Professor Zuboff, of course, has done decades of work on this subject. I have scanned some of her work. I have seen her laws of automation. I know about the upcoming project, and I think she, more than anyone else, understands the money that is made out of surveillance, that is the money that is made out of your information without asking you. She understands how big companies monopolize big profits through your presence online. Malka Older takes us, of course, to a futuristic world where information is the nation itself, and which is very important. If all of us are data, if you reduce every human being to data points, then as the data moves, all of us constitute information. That's it. There is nothing else about us now. And she talks about that information society, and she talks about how governance and countries will be challenged. So that's my first interjection, and how these two ladies are going to illuminate the conversation on this. The second issue that I want to talk about is the aggregation of the dissimilar, the aggregation of deviants. Now imagine there is a big nuclear protest taking place, anti-nuclear protest taking place in Europe, in Germany. We want to ban nuclear plants. Nuclear plants are bad for us. Big protest taking place. And there are these group of women in India, in a village, who don't have electricity, who are joining that protest. Now you would not expect that. That is counterintuitive. Here is a community without electricity, but suddenly they join and they support a protest taking place in a country which earns 40 times more than them on a per capita basis, and they are finding affiliations and aggregations with certain realities that are not their own. So there is as John B. Thompson, who wrote about mass media many decades ago, as he mentions, there is a despatialization of time, and the distance and time are both dead. We have perhaps reached a space where time no longer exists, everything is instantaneous, and territories therefore disappear, which means that many of our actions, responses, and beliefs and feelings have no mooring and no foundation in the real. It is all based on a certain digital notion. And I think that challenges the concept of what we define as communities, what we define as locality, and what we define as nation. In fact, someone, I think it was Anderson, who mentioned many years ago of a concept called imagined nations, and I think we have reached that stage. We are now living in something which is far more potent, and this is information nations. Nations based on information and how information moves. Who controls the flow of that information will control destinies of nation. So sometimes some companies can not only elect the president of the United States of America, as we have seen recently, but they can also decide how you spend, what you eat, what you wear, and how you behave with people. And I think that is the second part that I wanted to leave with you. The third part and the final part that I wanted to touch upon before I bring Professor Zuboff to join us this evening is on the whole concept of privacy and encryption. And I think it's important. This is again a European debate, but not everyone shares the European perspective. I was told some time ago in a business conference that if an idea comes out of Europe, it is a bad one when it deals with technology. And I'm being provocative here. These are not my words. I'm just relaying words that will provoke you into joining this conversation. They say it is normally a bad idea because Europe has this huge obsession about control of data and personal information, which prevents any useful big startup to emerge out of this continent. So in the business of unicorns, you will find unicorns are missing in Europe. The Chinese, the Americans, the Indians in some other countries are doing far better in the innovation space. So again, we need to think about the fine balance between privacy, between the use of information and encryption. And again, there are no answers that I have, but the two speakers who will join us certainly have spoken and written about this particular aspect. In India, there is a second debate that is taking place, and I think this is important again. In the last 2 years, we have done something remarkable and something which is quite dangerous as well. We have given digital identification to over 1 billion people. Less than 20% of them had passports and any other form of identities. Their first form of identification was a digital ID. We have also given to most of them now a bank account online. So they have a digital ID which is linked to a digital bank account. And both of these are linked to their mobile phones. We have over 1.3 billion mobile phones. So most Indians today have a mobile phone, a digital ID, and a bank account which are linked together. This has created a certain conversation in India, whether there is a danger in linking up these information and what happens if it falls in the wrong hands. What can happen? Can your bank account be robbed? Can your information be sold? Can you suddenly be made more vulnerable because of this kind of information being available to big companies, to big corporations, to big organizations that are now giving public service? And so the final point is that how dangerous or how useful is the idea of having information available with the private sector when the private sector is increasingly becoming the agent of providing public service. We used to believe that medical, education, infrastructure, and many other services like water and electricity were responsibilities of government. Increasingly, they are now delivered by the private sector. So should the private sector have access to the same information that governments did? Is the private sector more likely to use it in a bad way? What are the regulatory and policy cautions and policy measures that must be instituted before we allow this mass proliferation of individual data with big corporations. These are the points I wanted to leave with you before I invite Professor Zuboff. I think she's joining us now on the screens, and let me wait for technology to beam her in. Good evening, Professor. It's morning there. Good morning.
Yes. Good morning, good evening. Hello. I hope you've had a great day today.
Thank you for joining us. I'm really excited to be able to speak to you this evening, and let me invite all the audience here to welcome you with a warm round of applause for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's my privilege to be here.
I was telling them that you have done more work on this than most people I know of, and you have been speaking about the whole idea of automation, of surveillance, of control of big corporations, of things that we need to discuss today because they are increasingly important. So my first question to you this evening, Professor, is your notion of digital giants, your notion of these big companies becoming states onto themselves. And could you share your thoughts on this with us as the opening?
Yes, well, thank you. What I want to do is create some distinctions in our conversation, because I think that, just tuning into the last, just the tail end of your remarks, when you're asking, what are the consequences of all these data and all these functions being the responsibility of private firms. So, I began asking myself, how did we get into this situation where these private firms have accumulated not only such great concentrations of information, but also such great concentrations of rights without obligations, rights to data, rights to our privacy, without the obligation, the reciprocal obligation of them having to be transparent with us. So they have more or less accumulated all of the privacy rights in our societies. And we're left scrambling around, figuring out. I came into the kitchen the other night, and I have two children in their 20s, and they were discussing various forms of encryption. How good is Signal, and how good is Proton Email, and which browser will allow them to hide from these prying eyes most effectively. And, honestly, I said to them, I'm sorry. I feel somehow like, as your mom, I failed you, that you're now living in a civilization where you're sitting around the dinner table thinking about, how do I hide from these powers that are under no obligation to communicate with me, that operate largely under secrecy and deception, and that I have no control over. So this is the background of my query. And I feel that we've failed somehow in this conversation over the past decade because we haven't adequately made some key distinctions. Let me start with the first one. The first one is that we keep talking about technology. That's a big mistake. As long as we're talking about technology, we are vulnerable to what I call the ideology of inevitabilism. The idea that autonomy has a life of its own, that autonomy is autonomous, that autonomy of technology is derived from the fact that it somehow lives outside of the social in its own logic, in its own compulsions. And if we are to speak up and question or query or even resist, somehow we're labeled as Luddites and people who are not embracing the future. So I'd like to stop talking about technology, but what do we talk about instead? Well, I propose that instead we talk about capitalism, because every technology is embedded in an economic logic and deployed in an economic logic. This is not an insight that's new with me, nor is the idea of autonomous technology an insight that's new with me. But these are insights that every generation, every people has to discover and rediscover and apply for ourselves, because the compulsions of capitalism, the imperatives of capitalism are such that in each generation, in each new iteration of a global technology, these issues are imposed on us and brought before us for action, for resistance, not only for counter declarations, but for new synthetic alternatives. Okay, so we're talking about capitalism, which brings us to your question about private firms. I think one of the key things for us to distinguish now is that not all private firms are the same. What we have discovered in the last 10 years is that information capitalism is not information capitalism, if you take my point. Information capitalism, as it turns out, has evolved, mutated into distinct forms. Now, I have a long story in my book about how this happened, and I'm not going to get into all of that detail right now because that would take all our time together. So let me fast forward to a result. And the result is that one of the mutated forms of information capitalism that began to emerge early in the 2000s, really around 2002, in the firm of Google, as it developed, as it evolved, as it differentiated, it became what I call surveillance capitalism. What that means is that this particular market form learned how to flourish, learned how to transform assets into capital with a very specific set of mechanisms. And that set of mechanisms was that it discovered that the digital traces that we leave as we interact with its services could actually be repurposed as surplus, what I call behavioral surplus. And that surplus could be turned into a series of products, I call them prediction products, that become assets that are tradable. Those assets became tradable in new kinds of markets, markets for what I call markets in future behavior. So we have digital traces repurposed as surplus. That surplus goes into a factory. That factory turns the surplus into prediction products. Those prediction products are sold in markets for future behavior, and that is what produces what I call surveillance revenue. That set of mechanisms is what made Google wealthy, successful. Eventually, that logic, I call it logic of accumulation, was transferred to Facebook, other companies, not only the internet giants, but now companies throughout the economic sphere, obviously not only in the United States, but on a global basis. Now, what about some of the other internet companies? And here's where some interesting distinctions come into play. All of these companies are capitalists. They're all doing capitalism. And as we know, when capitalism is allowed to exist in its current form, untethered to society, untethered to social concerns, untethered to the real needs of populations, that spells trouble for our societies. And what we've learned over the past 30 years or so is that as neoliberalism helped to eviscerate economic controls, eviscerate the whole regulatory and legislative aspect of governmental control that tethered capitalism to the social, we've had an explosion of what I call raw capitalism. And even our largest internet companies are part of this conversation. So in my mind, when we talk about, for example, on Amazon, we're talking about real issues there that have to do with, in some cases, monopoly issues, in some cases, antitrust issues, that harken back to a long history, 20th century history of capitalism when it is allowed to move into this realm of excess, untethered to society. But that's not the same as surveillance capitalism. So what my aim has been is to really hone in on the logic and mechanisms of surveillance capitalism, understanding that right now we have, among the internet giants, referring back to your question, we have three firms that really have led the way in surveillance capitalism: Google, Facebook, and now Microsoft has joined that duo, I think, to make a triad. Among the other internet giants, we're seeing a blurring between the conventional forms of capitalism and its conventional harms, and now beginning to see in Amazon, for example, a kind of imbrication, a kind of entanglement in some new areas that begin to look like surveillance capitalism. So I think Amazon, for example, is a very mixed case at this point. If we look at Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, however, we are looking at surveillance capitalism, and that's where I believe that the harms to us as individuals, the harms to our societies, and the harms to the larger prospect of the democratic liberal order that our ancestors have worked so hard to achieve and for which we have suffered so much, those are in the target space, under duress, fighting for their lives.
Professor, let me ask you a question on this. I mean, certainly you spoke about the state we are in today, and yes. I think it's because we had the wrong conversations which allowed us to get to this point. But let me ask you now, so you certainly did, in a sense, predict that we would reach a state where private companies, digital companies would exercise state functions. What do we do now? Because if you were to take a poll in this room, I am quite certain that most of, and there are young people in this room, I think many of them would actually voluntarily become part of the surveillance capitalism. They would not think 2 minutes for using a Google Maps or Amazon service, and they would be so happy because the company is predicting their next behavior. What do we do now?
Probably they would even prefer to be citizens of Facebook than citizens of whatever other country.
Well, honestly, I spent the last 5 years of my life trying to answer that question. It's a big answer. But let me start with your use of the word state. I am very uneasy about this idea. I do not want us to honor these companies with the language of state, any more than I would honor them with the language of democracy. The logic of surveillance capitalism is such that the most significant impediment to surveillance revenues is the nature and operation, autonomous moral will, and autonomous mental operations of the individual.
Great. So
democracy.
At this stage, let me just quickly let everyone know that Malka Older is joining us. and she will also join into this conversation. Perhaps she can also respond to Professor Zuboff. Professor, sorry for interrupting you. Please go ahead.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So first of all, we're talking about a logic of accumulation in which the individual, as a source of moral judgment, as an autonomous mental operation, as the nexus of rights and obligations as we understand them in a democratic society, the individual, this autonomous individual of the democratic liberal order, is, for surveillance capitalism, a profound source of threat, a profound source of friction. And as I have come to understand the imperatives of surveillance capitalism, every aspect of its operations is designed to suppress, evade, subjugate, eliminate friction. That's why we hear that it's so important for everything to be connected. It's so important for everything to be smart. It's so important for every human and everything and every process to be part of a material, knowledgeable, connected, internet-enabled, smart, computational infrastructure that eliminates friction. So things like conflict, things like rights and obligations, things like contracts, these institutions that have been so essential to the discovery and rooting and flourishing of democracy are threats to surveillance capitalism. Second, surveillance capitalism has become the dominant form of capitalism in the digital sphere, the dominant form of information capitalism, the default model for every entrepreneur, every new startup, every new application, so that we're all subject to what psychologists have identified as a form of psychic numbing, where we need to participate through this medium. We need the goods that it produces. We need the results. We need the effectiveness that we're dependent upon it for. And we lose sight then, we become habituated to the way in which it has, it functions to herd us into these larger structures of connection and ultimately a kind of overall modulation and control of behavioral flows.
So, sorry, let me just ask you a question there, Professor. So what you've told us does not necessarily point to any great public policy fixes. I think what you are really suggesting is that there are a lot of social fixes that need to be at work to respond to many of these psychic numbing and this habitual need to be online, to share data, to leave traces, and to allow people to make money from it.
Yes.
I have a question. How many mothers, fathers, parents guide their young kids on what to do online? I mean, you spend hours and days and months teaching your children how to cross the street. But how many of us have ever invested in teaching the next generation on navigating the digital highways?
All right. Well, first of all, I want to disagree with your premise because a political solution is essential. A social solution is essential. We're talking about mobilization on a number of fronts here. And the reason is, and I think this gets to what originated your question, the reason is that while we begin with a discussion about capitalism, we begin with a discussion about a form of capitalism, surveillance capitalism, that has concentrated rights, concentrated decision rights over beginning with our privacy and ultimately with the form of our behavior as individuals and as a collective. And what I've suggested is that let's not grace this operation with the language of the state, because none of the requirements of a state exist here. We have no options, for example, for exit, voice, and loyalty, which are key operations, whether we're talking about in the public sphere or in the private sphere. We have no mechanisms for deciding on rights and obligations. We have no mechanisms for deciding on the division of learning. We have no mechanisms for deciding on authority. We have no mechanisms for deciding on the legitimate use and control of power. So without any of the mechanisms that we have come to associate with the state, unless we're talking about tyranny, which is a different kind of state, but if we're talking about a democratic state, we have no mechanisms for engaging with these companies in a way that brings them under our control, that turns them into we the people.
So every 5 years, we cannot vote out a Google or a Facebook. Fair enough. I think, and at multiple other levels, they don't have the same responsibility to each of us that the state does. That's a fair point. I want to bring Hannes in at this stage, and let me also, because I know Professor Zuboff has to leave us at some point, I want to bring in all of you sitting in this room. There are mics here.
Please.
There are mics here. And those who do want to ask the good professor a question, please do so. Hannes, can you pose the first question?
So, Professor Zuboff, thanks for joining us. So, you were talking about the inevitability and non-reversibility of the situation and this modus operandi of capitalism we're in, right?
Yes.
So we can't turn back the wheels of time. And you were talking about answers have to be formulated on two levels, social as well as political. And
yes.
We've had this discussion during the course of our day. Social answers, probably it's up to any one of us to start changing individual behavior or associating with others concerning childhood, childcare, whatever. But on the political front, I don't see any potential to thoroughly regulate companies such as the ones you have mentioned on a global scale. Because if I remember the San Bernardino shooting, where Apple, for example, which you didn't mention, refused to share its information with the US government. You
Yes.
even saw that the company, if the US government had dared to smash Apple has its assets dispersed globally, they would probably just have re-established in India. So somewhere else. So there is no state power powerful enough, and we can't turn back, and it's actually not really working for us. So the idea comes up, shouldn't we just move forward and build a new form probably of statehood? And that was something I wanted to ask you.
Yes. Well, I don't agree that there's no political solution. If you've read my work, you know that I have compared, for example, Google to General Motors,
right.
Where General Motors, early 20th century, Ford Motor Company, General Motors, the rise of mass production. When those forms of industrial capitalism, which produced many harms for workers and for society, when those forms were first introduced, our societies were defenseless. We were not prepared to integrate mass production capitalism into society in a way that would allow both market and democracy to flourish. It took several decades, Hannes, for that political accomplishment. And there are famous cases, of course. I know the U.S. history best here. Somewhat, I'm somewhat familiar with the German legislative history here, where these restraints came on much earlier than they did in America. But speaking of the U.S. case, for example, it really took from the 1880s all the way into the 1930s for a substantial body of regulatory and legislative legal action so that we could say that mass production capitalism was adequately integrated into the needs of society, enabling collective bargaining and the control of working conditions and working hours and working ages and all of those kinds of things that eventually we came to take for granted. I believe that we are not at the end of this story of surveillance capitalism, but rather we are at the beginning, and that things look dire now, I understand, and with the current political leadership, it seems like being able to regain control of our political apparatus, to exercise the kind of regulatory and legislative work that is necessary to reintegrate this form of capitalism into society. It seems like it's a prospect that's receding rather than getting closer. But again, if history is any guide, we have gone through this before, and we have come out doubling down on democratic mechanisms and being able to harness capitalism. So while on the one hand, and this goes back to the discussion about technology, if we're only talking about technology, it does seem really hard to harness technology. But if we understand that how the technology is deployed is a function of a specific form of capitalism, I do think that harnessing capitalism is within our means, and now perhaps on the brighter side more than ever, because as we're living through the current political crisis every day, more and more we are seeing, a greater consensus that neoliberalism has run its course, a greater public consensus that we need to reassert the values of democracy and equality, economic and social equality, a greater consensus that democracy is our most precious achievement and we must fight for it at any cost. So sometimes the darker it gets, the more we are awakened from this habituation and numbing that we have kind of fallen into. And I think about this very dialectically, Hannes, not linearly. And I believe that all of us working together, this kind of collective reassertion of the power of the social and the power of the individual is within our grasp.
Thank you, Professor. Let me also at this stage invite Malka Older to join us. Thank you for waiting patiently. You've heard some of the debate. You've been introduced to the audience already. We can do two things. One, of course, you could respond or you could join in the conversation that we've already been having, and I'm sure you have something to say there. And so I'll give you first enough time to share your thoughts on what we just had a conversation on. But I would also, at this stage, invite you to share your thoughts on the future world that you paint so vividly in what is described as a punk sci-fi in one of the reviews that I read, where you have created this new world of multi-layered governance managed through corporations and sentinels. Although I do detect, and this is my personal view, I do detect a degree of fatalism where you, in a sense, have agreed or you have reached a position where the state as it exists today is certainly dispensable. Malka, over to you.
Thank you so much. And Thank you for having me here, and I've very much enjoyed listening to the conversation so far. I agree with Professor Zuboff on almost everything she said, with the possible exception of when she said that democracy is our most precious achievement. While I agree that it is one of the most important things we've developed, I'm not sure that we've entirely achieved it yet. And I was coming at the problem in my book from the opposite angle than she is in her work. So rather than looking at the corporations and the power that they have aggregated, which I agree is a huge problem, I was looking at the problem of nation states as they exist now and the limitations that they put on democracy, among other things. So to talk about how I looked at this in my work, which is not intended to be a perfect solution or the only solution or the best solution, but which is intended to bring out some of the possibilities that technology in particular is opening up to us as we move forward in looking at how to improve democracy and improve the governance that we are creating for ourselves. In my book, it's a future some 50 years from now in which the nation state has dissolved with a few exceptions that still exist. And the rest of the world is under a type of democracy known as micro-democracy, in which the basic unit of governance is 100,000 people living in a neighborhood, perhaps if it's a very dense area, or living spread across hundreds of hectares if it's someplace rural and dispersed. These 100,000 people, roughly, can choose any government they wish out of all of the governments that exist in the world. So with a government being a set of policies, of taxes, of laws, of approaches to managing the various aspects of life that we currently believe are influenced by government: education, healthcare, defense, different social policies, and so forth. So there's this vast network of governments. You may have a different government from your neighbors a couple of blocks over. Likewise, a government may have constituents that are scattered all over the world. And part of the way that this system functions in my hypothetical future is that there is a massive bureaucracy known as information, which collects all the information that is available, both from a larger number of cameras and closed circuit and this kind of observation, but also all of the sort of digital traces that we leave, making online searches and so on. But they also, as they collect this information, they compile it, but they also make it available to everyone in the world, sometimes somewhat aggressively, in the sense of putting annotations on speech that doesn't seem to be quite true. Sometimes putting data out in the form of infographics when people are trying to make decisions, particularly about elections, but also potentially about economic decisions. So there's the internet and information management in general has become a sort of public good that's run by this autonomous agency, which is not for profit, which is not exactly a government, although they certainly influence governance in a very strong way. And it has become, in a sense, unified, while government has become fragmented and very much a choice for people to make. One thing that has surprised me a lot about the reception to this book is the degree to which, and the number of people who considered this book to be a dystopia. Even though, from my perspective, I was presenting a very hopeful, certainly not a utopia, certainly not a perfect solution, but a very hopeful approach to the way we might go forward and continue to work on improving our governance and the ways that we live together as societies. And I wonder if part of the reason that it was called a dystopia or called cynical by so many is because there's a sort of reaction to the idea of government or international agency surveillance that makes people very disturbed, even though in this case the surveillance is not helpful.
Malka, I'll just interrupt you at this stage. We will thank Professor Zuboff for joining us. She has to leave us at this stage. Thank you so much, Professor, for sharing your work and your thoughts on this very important issue with all of us. Please join me in thanking her for her intervention.
Yes, thank you. I found her ideas very, very interesting and very useful for this conversation. If I can just finish my thought, and then I'll turn it back over to you. So I do think that there's a sort of reaction to government surveillance that raises a lot of concerns, even though at the same time, almost all of the surveillance that I describe in my book is already going on, as Professor Zuboff noted, on the part of private companies. And people participate very willingly, and as you've said already, quite happily, in that surveillance.
Yeah, so, I have two questions. Because in what you've just, the scenario you have just painted for us perhaps requires a little bit more elaboration in terms of two actors. What happens to corporations and how are they governed? Because in many ways your daily lives are managed through information, which is the bureaucracy. Is that privatized? Is that for profit? Is that a public service in itself? And certainly, what is the basis of aggregation of these 100,000? Is it geographical? Is it identity? Is it similar perceptions? Is it similar worldviews? So, for example, 100,000 anti-nuclear protesters can create this small unit and live in that unit.
So, I'll start with the latter question to clarify that first. The 100,000 unit is geographically based. So there is that small tie to geography. However, that 100,000 can then choose a government from anywhere in the world. So 100,000 people can elect democratically to belong to an anti-nuclear government, which may have a base somewhere far away, which may include other constituents from other parts of the world. So there's a small geographic tie. Beyond that, the way people choose their government is based on affiliation, worldview, the most important issues to them, their idea of what will spur their economy, and so forth. So this idea came to me out of two sort of separate but converging experiences. One is the experience of living in and working in a number of different countries with separatist movements, which, if you take a broad view of separatist movements, is almost every country in the world, because almost every country has some part of it which is looking to separate and form a different country because they have different interests, because they see themselves as a different group that's not adequately represented by the majority group. And this is one of the issues that democracy is facing as we become pluralist, as we look at pluralism and try to align that with the idea of democracy, which is essentially a majority rule. And there are a lot of different ways that different democracies are working to adjust and to allow pluralism in various forms in a system of voting and of majority rule. And so it's solvable. It's something that is certainly improvable as we go. But it is still an issue at this point with the way that we are running governance, the way that we're running democracies. And the other side of that was looking at elections in the United States, although you could look at them anywhere, where now we have the ability to really look at a very granular level at the way people vote. And so in the United States, to use that as an example, you can see at the county level which counties are going to one side or the other in, let's say, a presidential election. And it's often quite scattered. And you will see blue counties living right next to red counties. They have very different opinions. Some of them are, quite personality-based or based on a party affiliation. Some of them are based on policy. And so it was interesting to me to think about how it could be that these people living next to each other can choose completely different policies and government systems and taxes and so on for their lives. And they could go on living next to each other in that same way. So there's a small unit of geography, and then from there on it's affiliation, it's ideas about what type of government suits best, it's interests that may be based on geographical issues that are tied to economy, and so forth. Now, you asked about corporations and the role of information. So information in this conception is, it's a kind of a cross, we could say, between the United Nations and the computing power of Google without the actual Google part. Because information is, in theory, a public good. Now, we know from our experience with both government public goods and international public goods, such as the United Nations, that they do, in fact, have agendas. They're not completely neutral. But this is the sort of idea behind it. So what does happen to corporations is, because it's fairly easy in this system to form a government, again, meaning a system of policies and taxes and economic initiatives and so forth. Most of the large corporations, either on their own or in a conglomeration with other corporations, have just gone and formed governments. These governments are distinct from the corporations in that they need to run certain policies. But those policies are generally designed to make things easy and profitable for the corporations that are involved.
Hannes, you wanted to ask something.
I'm sorry. So, Malka, hi. Thanks for joining us. And
My pleasure.
so, you've been working in these like disaster areas and trying to rebuild a little bit of a functioning society for people, right?
Yes.
So, what did you find the core functions of a state during your work there? What are these like essential functions?
Well, I think that's a great and really interesting question, in part because I don't think it's a question that's fully answered either in the theory or in the practice, which is part of the reason that I wanted to come up with a vision of a society in which there are many different answers to it in many different governments that may take on different types of mandates. So I think that there's a sort of underlying theory that we have to the state, which is kind of primarily a monopoly on violence within its territory. But I think, what we find today, as in our own societies, as well as in societies that have been broken down by one or another kind of catastrophe, is that people generally are looking for a lot more than that from their state, or at a minimum from their sort of local government, or from their local leaders, whoever those are. And if none of those appear in a situation of disaster, it's going to be for the people who step up and do take some kind of leadership. People look for leadership. People look for organization. And I will say, too, that what I've found in my experience of working in places where everything has fallen apart, the most important thing is not money and it is not technology. It is organization. It is some way of people coming together and making decisions about the way that both responsibilities and assistance is divided up among the constituent members.
So, I would like to push back on two ideas. And again, I would at this stage invite any of you to also pose questions to Malka. There's a mic in the room and we can reach out to you. But let me push back, Malka, on two ideas. I think there is a fundamental assumption that homogeneity is linked to territory, which basically suggests that in the same geographical unit, you are likely to find 100,000 people who would want the same kind of existence. Now that is very true of the areas where you have done a lot of work, especially where you have insurgent movements, you have land right issues, they are normally tribal areas, agricultural areas. But in a city like New York, you might have a very different scenario where every block of 100,000 people would want a very different world. How does your model work in a dense urban setting where two neighboring 100,000 units have very different demands around energy? One wants nuclear, one doesn't want nuclear. One wants a certain form of water consumption pattern, one wants a very different lifestyle. How is that reconciled in a dense urban setting? So that's my first pushback. I have a second one, but let's try and take this first.
Sure. It's a great question. And actually, the idea that affiliation is tied to geography is one of the things that I'm really pushing back against. So we can think of this 100,000, these, I call them sentinels, these groups, they're almost they're a vestigial sort of thing. It's like the system, they weren't sure that they would be able to get along without any kind of geographic linking. So they shrank it. And in fact, at the end of the book, they start talking about next election, can we go down to a unit of 10,000 people? Eventually, can we shrink it down further? But there are things, we do still live in our geography. And particularly when we think about government services, there's still a number of things that we need to deal with on the real world, the IRL, in real life level. So certainly the idea of people disagreeing on which government they want within that 100,000 is a very legitimate issue. One of the larger problems that urban areas deal with under this system is how to provide services that require economies of scale or connections across different geographic areas in a city that has entirely different governments So thinking about things like sewage, like power production, like public transportation. These are issues that have become very difficult in this new system. But it is certainly an issue that with 100,000 people, you could very easily disagree with your neighbors vehemently on the kind of government that is chosen. But one of the things that I found interesting as a byproduct of this system, and was not the initial impetus, but which I think is one of the main things to recommend it, is that in this system, the power of a government is not based on territory, but on population. Meaning that a government that is attractive to a lot of people will win a lot of sentinels. They will have more people. And that's how a government becomes big, not by geographic size. And if you can convince a lot of people to immigrate into your area, then that area will perhaps be split into 2 areas at the next election, and you will have more people under your government. So when population is the thing that governments are looking for, rather than territory, it means that immigration is much more likely to be not just tolerated, but encouraged. And I think that also leads to an interesting crossover of thought in terms of what we're talking about of large companies starting to take on some of the roles of government, because large companies certainly look for more people. They're looking for market share. They're looking for more and more people to use them. And so if there is a citizenship of Facebook or a citizenship of Twitter or Google, it's going to be a situation in which immigrating into that citizenship is something that's seen as valuable rather than something that's seen to fight against. And I think that governments as well, obviously we can see the difference. The problem with that analogy right now is that Facebook and Google and so on, they're not providing the sort of benefits and the sort of rights to citizens that governments are at this point. But I do think that governments as well should be recognizing that economically having more citizens is generally a positive, and immigration should be something governments should be competing for us to immigrate to them rather than the other way around.
And the second pushback was if we were to miraculously improve the third tier of democracy today, which is exactly what you're talking about, the 100,000 people who live at the smallest geographical unit, if we were to miraculously improve the third tier of democracy, make it work for the people, make it something that is shaped by their aspirations, how would it be different to your world?
Well,
other than the fact that what I'm suggesting is truly science fiction, I don't think we can make it happen. and I also hate my neighbor, so let me just put it out there.
I mean, we can hope and we can keep working for it. But, the difference is that there are certain things that are easier to do, that are better managed at an aggregate level. Not all, and certainly in the world that I've created, while bigger in the sense of having more population, again, not larger territory, bigger is more powerful. But it's not necessarily better. And there are some governments in this world that stick to a very local level, and they're very concerned about local interests and local problems, and that's all they do. So they are essentially the local governments that we would consider. However, there are, we do have a lot of cross-border problems in this world. And the example you used, which I love, of the nuclear protest, while on the one hand, the people in Germany and the people in India who are participating in this protest have certainly very different realities in terms of their electricity use and accessibility, as well as many other issues, they also recognize that a nuclear accident could potentially be a cross-border or even global problem that could affect all of them. And that's only one example of many different types of issue. Obviously, climate change is a big one that we're thinking about now, but also things like, water contamination upstream to downstream. And so there are a number of different issues where it makes sense to have a larger collective aggregated government. There's also the fact that creating a government in itself is quite costly in terms of time. And there's also the fact that we have a relatively short experience of sort of country hours, as it were, of different forms of government. And so having experimentation and being able to compare across different types of government and choose one that already exists rather than coming up with an entire new one has some benefits as well.
There's a question from the audience. Kindly introduce yourself and ask the question, please.
Hi. Hello? Right.
Yes.
Hi, Silvan from Operation Libero. I just have one question. Maybe I missed it, excuse when the question has already been answered in your speech. I really like the idea of like choosing the state in fact of a liberal perspective of that the states are also in kind of a market, so that you have to give something to the people that they will be here. Just like also for me as the idea of free migration is some kind of going in this direction, but even here it's not even fixed to a geographic movement. So I really like the idea. But then can this microstates reject people?
Yes, great question that hasn't been answered yet. In my book, again, the system I come up with in my book is not intended to be utopian. It still has a number of problems with it. And in the theory of this book, the governments are quite sovereign. They can decide what they want to do. And if they want to have blocks on immigration, although practically it may be difficult, but they can certainly put a wall around themselves if they feel like that's a useful thing. And so this is possible. The idea is that the system has incentives that encourage being welcoming towards immigration, but it's not actually put in place. And that's one of the things that the characters in the book come across and debate as one of the issues, as something that is still a problem and a friction in their system, and something they're trying to decide how to find a way to improve. And certainly a system like this where people are deciding on their government based on affiliation also has the risk of a kind of segregation that's based not necessarily on ideas of policy or ideas of economy or ideas of government, but also on things like skin color or religion and so forth. And so this is one of the questions that the people are still struggling with, is how you can combine democracy at different levels and in different forms with people's desires to do things that, as pluralists and as liberals, we're maybe not sure that that's the best way to go.
Malka, this is Hannes again. So your world offers a niche for a little Nazi centennial that wants to build a wall and also hit others and stuff like that. But I was reminded of the private cities that have been constructed around the world recently. So these are places like in Egypt, built by the Saviris family, that are like entire cities, but they are organized, their civil life is orchestrated by a security company, for example. And people can buy into that place. And usually they're built in countries with a very weak legal system. So they effectively run the city. So what's the difference between your world and a private city world? And how do you look at private cities? Do you like this idea then?
So potentially, to answer, yes, there's the potential for this sort of segregationist and separatist sort of idea within this. And there's, again, it's this tension between the pluralism, democracy of allowing people to choose what they like, and then the idea that some things are perhaps beyond the pale of what we want to allow in our society as a whole. And so one thing that I think is important when we talk about democracy is that democracy is not something that can necessarily stand by itself, because democracy by itself is in fact oppression of the minority. But democracy requires, and not only that, but if we as a group are choosing things, we have issues with the commons, the tragedy of the commons. We have issues with things that we can do as a group against our own benefit, particularly in the long term. And so I think one of the things that is really required for democracy to function as a healthy form of governance is a baseline, at a minimum, a baseline of human rights. And so that's something that's one of the solutions that's sort of brought up in my book is, okay, you can have your own place, but you can't do certain things to other people who happen to fall in there. You can't keep people from leaving, even if you want to keep people from coming in. And there's certainly a kind of hope that in this marketplace of governments, certain governments would not do very well. But I think that's debatable. I mean, we've seen that there are a lot of people who will choose kind of ugly segregationist governments. And so that's one answer. In terms of the private cities, I do think that there needs to be, when we talked about the difference between improved local governance and the system, there is a kind of participation in the world, in global norms and interactions with other governments that I think is an important form of this system.
Malka, you have in your previous response briefly touched on the issue of identity. Now, I wonder if at the end of, say, 100 years of the existence of your world, if one or two governments will dominate all the units that exist in the world at that time. So will we eventually see a homogenization that was the ideal of Marxism, that was the ideal of capitalism, that was the ideal of neoliberalism, which is basically to try and attract as many into your system of existence, and are we going to eventually see one or two winners emerge in terms of systems of governance, and how will that be different to other competitions that we've seen in the last 200 years?
I mean, gosh, I really hope not, because I'm a person personally who sees diversity as a good in and of itself, not just because of the other things that it allows. And I certainly like the idea. One of the things that's very attractive to this proposition for me is the idea of living in a city where I could walk into a different government that has a different approach to things, and therefore a slightly different lifestyle, a slightly different way of being in the real world than where I live most of the time. It's a little bit like from the United States when we go to Europe. Sometimes it just seems like all these countries are so close together and we can explore all these different cultures. Now, we do have different cultures in the United States. They're not always as noticeable because of language and other reasons. But for me, what I like to see in this is a wide diversity of governments, not only on the sort of big ideas of communism versus capitalism, but also a lot of the smaller local concerns of, do we allow buskers on the street in this government and that government? Do we, how carefully do we manage food hygiene in this government and in that government? And what sort of effects do those things? Do we, maybe this government right here is pedestrian only because we're very strongly concerned about the environment, and also we think it's a good quality of life choice. And this government over here has designed roads that enable people to use cars in a useful way. So I think for me, I'm hoping, and what I'd like to see is a much more sort of granular differentiation of what people prefer to live in their life, that then also allows the immigration so that you can easily move from one to another, either as your preferences shift or as you disagree with the people around you. And it's that sort of aspect of it is in many ways quite utopian and idealized. And there's certainly a risk that particularly we know that incumbency, that name recognition, that size can affect the way people vote. And so there's certainly a risk that people would start to vote themselves into one or more sort of large governments that seem glamorous and professional and exciting and have benefits in terms of economies of scale. So there is, and one of the big issues that people wrestle with in the book is again, how can you provide the information to people that really allows them to make good choices about their lives without being paternalistic about the choices that they're making. And so that, comes back again to this sort of global public good of information that is quite aggressive, again, about getting information into people's faces. And yet there's still a big problem in getting people to pay attention to certain aspects of life and getting people to look beyond the surface. For example, one of the things in these elections, information does not provide video of debates. It's all audio. Kind of like this, because I can't see any of you, even though you can see me. And that's, an idea to try and keep people from voting on what the spokespeople look like, on the appearance, what they're wearing, what skin color they have, what nationality they seem to be, what they've done with their hair, which seems to be something that actually affects people quite a lot in our elections today. And yet people keep asking for video, people keep asking for spokespeople for the governments that are trying to be more policy-based. I think we face a lot of challenges in how we pay attention to the things that matter in governance and that affect our lives.
I'm going to come back to you on global public goods of information, but first there's a question from the audience. Please introduce yourself and ask Malka the question you want to.
Hi, my name is Lisa. So I think your idea is very interesting, but I'm not sure that I fully understood, so I would like you to clarify a few things for me. And so on the one hand, you said that you would like to have a more regional approach so that people could choose between governments and choose what they think is right for them. And on the other hand, you said that it is necessary that there are some topics, some big topics like climate change or something like that, that have to be addressed on a more global scale. So my question is, couldn't the system you described also be achieved by a more liberal approach? So to say, to limit every government's power only to the absolute necessities, and to leave it to every region to decide on their own laws and on their own ways of living. And then in that case, I don't understand really how the new technology and the new communication systems come into that vision of the world.
I think she has asked two specific things of you, Malka, and sorry if I'm putting words in your mouth, but there are two questions she has asked. The first poser is that how do you reconcile the micro-governance model with key global governance questions, and how are you going to overcome the problems of the collective that we face today? How is it different? And could a more liberal approach today itself not result in similar outcomes that you seek to achieve? I think that's the first question she's asking. The second she's asking is, what is the importance of territory? What is the importance of digital communities? And how does that play into the whole concept of geographical units, when actually someone sitting across 7,000 miles can have a greater degree of affinity and connectivity?
Yes, exactly. So the problem of global concerns and global issues is one of the things that is still a problem, and maybe even exacerbated in my system, which I want to be clear about and recognize. Because global and as I said, even regional, even if you have two separate governments, and this happens today with different countries that are upstream and downstream of a watershed, for example, or countries that have one policy, you have the smog from Indonesia coming off and covering the Singapore airport. And this cross-border problems are very common today, and it would be made even worse in this system. And so there is a question of how you can look at global problems, either through sort of consortia of some of the larger governments that get together, or through something that is an umbrella mechanism that is a kind of like the United Nations. In the book, we have the system information, which is supposed to be all about information management, but they end up looking at how they take on some of these larger issues, and that causes a lot of problems because they're not, in fact, elected. They're meant to be a technical sort of service, and simply because they're global, they end up taking a role that's beyond that, and it's very problematic in the book. So I do think that these are legitimate questions and legitimate problems with the system. One thing that I hope the system does add to is, because again, the government can be not just regional, but perhaps have a couple of people in what's now the United States, and a couple of sentinels in West Africa, let's say, and a couple of sentinels in Central Asia, that a government that is spread out like that should have a bit more of a perspective on the different effects and the different causes of global problems across the world. And for me, what the difference to that than to having the way the world is today, but with more local control, That's very close to what I'm thinking about. And I think that the way that we are looking to solve these problems currently in the world is a combination of decentralization, which goes, more power at the local level, and umbrella organizations like the European Union, like ASEAN, like Mercosur, that try to consolidate certain functions of government and have certain umbrella rules for the people, the governments under them. And so, I think a lot of what is going on in governance and in geopolitics to a certain extent today has to do with figuring out what is the balance, what do we decentralize and what do we consolidate, and what are the most useful ways to do that? What are the elements of autonomy that are most important to devolve, and what are whether it's economic policies, whether it's human rights policies, what are the things that's most important to have a broad consensus on? And how do we design our democratic systems so that people can vote on both of those and feel like they're getting what they need at the local level, but also have some of the benefits of having a larger society that they're a part of? So what I'm suggesting, again, is not that different from that. I do think that there's an interesting and important point to be made for the disassociation with geography. And I think that's partly where the technology comes in. I will say the technology in my book is, there's some fun things in my book technologically that are quite far from where we are now. But there's a lot of it that's, especially in terms of the way the government system works, that is perfectly doable from the state that we're in now. There are a lot of nation states now that have satellite outposts that are geographically not connected to them. In the United States here we have Alaska. France has overseas territories. There's Gibraltar, there's Ceuta, there's any number of different states that are divided up geographically, and they manage to maintain their sovereignty, maintain their governance across these spaces. And that right now it's so much easier than it was when many of these situations came into existence. But what's important for me is that this sort of spreading out of government does not happen just because the way it does now of legacies of colonialism or various different types of exploration and trade and selling Alaska and so forth that occurred in the past, and that now have left us with this very interesting map of very interesting path-dependent borders. But the people would have a choice as to where they wanted to belong.
So I'm going to now invite people to come in for the last round of questions. We already have one candidate here. Introduce yourself and please pose the question. But we are taking the final round, so please don't be shy and come in. I know Hanas has raised his hand. Anyone else? Can I get any other hand here? No one behind me? Great. So we'll go to the gentleman with the mic and then to Hanas, and then I will pose the final question. And over to you, sir.
Thank you. I'm Oscar, and I have a question. This may be or may not be answered in the discussion, but in these territories with these sentinels in your world, is there some kind of police or general
law and order?
Yeah, that's right. Because if we have a group of Nazis, or that's just an example, that are violent in a kind of way, they have a violent nature, and attacking others who have other political beliefs because they think their political beliefs are the right ones. Do we have some kind of control, or?
So do we have police forces? Do we have border guards? Do we have armies?
Yes, this is an excellent question. And in fact, one of the first questions that my editor asked me when we were editing the book was, where are all the nukes? Because it's certainly there's both internal and external threats. And that is, again, the sort of fundamental role of the state as it was initially created several hundred years ago, was to protect its populace against particularly external threats. And then it became as much or more about internal threats. So it's a great question. And it's one that is answered somewhat in the book. It's a very interesting problem, I think, reading the book as to whether the solution in the book would work or not. I think maybe to a certain extent. So in the book, basically there are some governments that are completely based around the idea of being military, and they contract out their services to other governments. So there are certain governments that, one can imagine, certainly with the US military, there are enough people in the US military to form quite a lot of these sentinels, and a lot of them are geographically concentrated. So there's a sense that some militaries of former governments have become their own government. They have their own way of living, which they're quite accustomed to and which they prefer, those who want to stay. And so one can imagine that their government has a very hierarchical system, and the laws are quite conforming with what the military previously was used to. And they tend to contract out their services, particularly to smaller governments. Larger governments that have a lot of sentinels all over the world may decide to recruit or draft or design their own military and use that for their defense. But there are also these other bodies which are governments in their own right, and which the way that they survive economically is by providing these services. There's also the idea that information itself has some security force. It's relatively small and not hugely strong, and so there is a potential threat to this system, in that if people decide not to go along with it, there is a risk of how they will be either forced to or forced to not disturb the others who do want to go along with it. It's one of the big dilemmas with all of the systems of global governance that we should come up with. But again, the sort of hope in this system, and the book as it takes place, there's a kind of Pax Democratica that's been in place for about 20 years, and which is, slightly fudged by the information management system, because there have certainly been low-level conflicts occasionally. But the way they set the bar for an actual, what they want to call a war, it hasn't gone past that. And a lot of that has to do with the sort of economic incentives that are in place and the lack of incentives for going to war that exist in this system. They also have a problem, particularly in the second book, when the remaining nation states, if some of the remaining nation states are at war with each other, and that threatens the borders with microdemocracy, of how they're going to defend against that. Because although these militaries exist, they are, relatively small and weak compared to what we think of now. And so, the hope is mainly around incentives and the sort of economic dividend that so far, at least in recent history, has shown to be not a bad preventer and mitigator of war. When states have strong economic ties, that's certainly something that's helpful in preventing war. So that's kind of the theory, and it's as I said, it's something that's interesting to think about as to whether it would work in practice.
Hannes.
So Malka, one of the main issues in your book for information, which is kind of a global agency, is to fight fake news, right? So fake information. Just to give us a last moment of your book, do you remember any incident where information went into action? Is there a scene that you remember from your own book?
Sure. There's a scene right at the beginning of my book, actually, in which there's a sort of kind of a voter rally, a generalized you should vote in the election rally going on in Buenos Aires, and some activists for one side or another. Because information, in the sense of the internet, is very much controlled, it's kind of hard to put fake information on there, because it's, as I said, there's this big, huge bureaucracy of people going through and trying to either remove lies or annotate them or provide infographics to give both sides, or, so they need to do something physical. And what they end up doing is designing these wicks in the shape of words that they can set on fire. So there's these huge words written in fire on top of a building. And then once it exists in the real world, people, of course, video it and take pictures of it and share it with all their friends. And so in that way, the misinformation can spread quite quickly. And it takes time to shut it down. It takes time to go and find all the places where it's been shared and annotate and discuss and so on. And so that kind of illustrates the problem of how you can control the way that information spreads, even when you have control over the medium and the means of spreading it, how difficult it can be to really address this misinformation.
So this was fascinating, the most fascinating point about your book for me, finally, that in order to erect a new kind of like a world order, even a democratic world order, she had to totally control the entire internet. That's rather majestic, right?
To me, it sounded a bit, and maybe I'm getting it wrong, but to me, it sounded a bit like censorship. It sounded a bit like conditional freedom of expression.
Yeah, of course, and it's a very fine line, and it's not intended to be a utopia, and it's certainly intended to be a system which, for me, this came out of fake information before the most recent election. But if you look back at the previous elections, both in the United States and in other places where I've been during elections, I mean, you can look at in the United States the 2008 election. You can look at the 2012 election, the 2004 election. There was actually a word for misinformation in the 2004 election called swift voting because of an incident that, it happened. There was outrage. It worked. The person it was directed against lost the election. And then we kind of forgot about it. We had this whole word that came into our lexicon, and then we forgot about it, and it happened again in 2008, and it happened again in 2012 with varying degrees of success. While being very conscious of the fact that having a single source of information is an extremely dangerous thing, I wanted to try out that idea and to play with it because right now we see in the US that having multiple sources of information that don't cross over, where there's no real authority, even at this point, dictionaries and encyclopedias and Wikipedia and the different places that people go to get information in history books are all quite suspect in the eyes of certain segments of the population who believe kind of that anything mainstream, again, a very vague and easily misdefined word, is suspect. And so we have a problem where you can't actually dig down and agree, never mind about policies, never mind about individuals, but facts of history, facts of science become very difficult to find agreement on and convince people on. And so, I wanted to play with this and see what it would be like to have an authority on information that's supposedly neutral, and we know nothing can be completely neutral, but it has, certain aspirations to neutral. And so instead of having us be able to choose our information and decide, based on what information streams we consume, gives us some ideas about what government we would like, and if we can't have it, then creates a lot of friction and anger and divisiveness. To look at having us be able to choose our government and have a quite granular, geographically quite granular division among many different kinds of government as suit the people within them, but have instead a unified system of information that we can't exactly choose from. So,
Malka, at this stage, let me thank you for engaging with all of us this evening. I think you were forthright, forthcoming. You've painted a vivid picture of a future world that must exist today. Micro-governance must work, multi-layered governance must work if the world is to be a better place. I really enjoyed talking to you. Let me request all of us gathered here to give you a hand for your fascinating conversation, for this fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Really been a pleasure.
Before I hand it back to Hannes for the final word from our chair this evening, let me just say that we heard two formidable women speak about very important issues. I think what we heard in the first presentation was a plea that it's time that we take back some of what we have involuntarily surrendered in the last few decades. Individuals must be more attentive to how the digital world is evolving. Policymakers must pay more attention, must become more engaged, and the social of the social media must be more important than the media of social media. I think the society must be placed before anything else. That was the first plea, how we can work as individual societies and policymakers to further and to better this digital world. I must share that I will go back and tweet about all of this and put a lot of Facebook posts, so I'm one of those who has voluntarily ceded my privacy for the benefit of Google and Facebook, but that's bad me, don't follow me. The second lady and the second presenter this evening actually spoke about real world problems that we are faced with today, and real world solutions that we now need to enact in our everyday lives. In the garb of science fiction, she has really spoken about problems of governance today. How do you reconcile aspirations of 100,000 people when there is a global government sitting and deciding the future of the world? Did you ask the village in India when you decided that no, thermal power will not be available to you anymore, you will wait till your country can afford renewable energy? Did we ask that question to the villager? We did not. So how do you marry micro-governance to macro-governance to global governance is a fundamental question of our times. Can technology help us do it? I guess not. I guess eventually it has to flow from people again. So both of them spoke of very similar issues, which was the agency of the individual, the actions of each of us, who can change the world and who can make a contribution, who can actually disrupt democracy, who can eventually effect a new Treaty of Westphalia that organizes nation states and their relationship with their citizens in a new way. Thank you very much. Let me hand it back to Hannes. I enjoyed being with you this evening. Hannes.
Thank you, Samir. Thank you so much, Samir. There's very little to add, except then thank you so much. And I found something really striking between these two people joining us. Shoshana said there's also a time for vision during times of crisis, and I think we're safe to say there's a crisis we're currently experiencing, in a societal crisis, a crisis of democracy. And to me, Malka is the representation of a person coming up, formulating visions. And what we must understand now is that Shoshana was saying there must be political answers, there must be societal answers, but what Malka is pointing out, that technology really must be a part of that answer. So we must act on even more levels, I think. And that to me is like the concluding remark. It's a little finding still, but I think that's what I want to say. And also, thank you for coming here and staying with our two digital guests and our physical guests who made all the way from India to join us. And thank you for all the people here at Kampnagel to help with this great event, which I enjoyed thoroughly. Thank you so much.